The letter arrived with someone else's fate written inside it. I remember the exact weight of the envelope in my hands, cream-colored, thick, sealed with pressed wax the color of dried blood. My name was not supposed to be on it. My name was barely supposed to exist in the same sentence as anything related to the bonding council, the ceremony, or any alpha whose bloodline ran older than the hills themselves. I was Jim Ball's second son of a merchant family, an omega who smelled faintly of cedar in old books, and whose most significant life achievement up to that point had been memorizing the entire catalog of a rare botanical archive in the city library where I worked 3 mornings a week. I was nobody. And yet, there it was, my name, written in the clean looping script of the council's official scribe, James Oliver Ball, designated Omega, bonding ceremony, 14 days hence. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me most of all. I stood in the narrow hallway of the apartment I shared with my older brother, stared at that envelope until the letters blurred, and felt something move through me that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite excitement. It was something older than both, something that lived in the marrow of every Omega who had ever lived, a bone-deep awareness that their life was about to be rerouted by forces they had never consented to. My brother Marcus came thundering down the stairs, took one look at my face, and went very still. Jim. His voice was careful, the voice he used when he thought something might break. "What is that?" "An invitation," I said, apparently. He crossed the hall in 3 steps and took the letter from my fingers before I could decide whether to hand it over or not. His eyes moved fast, the way they did when he was cataloging information, preparing arguments, building battlements out of words. Marcus was a lawyer. He fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves. He was very good at it, and for one wild, desperate moment I thought he would find a clause, a loophole, some ancient precedent that would unpeel my name from that envelope and send it back to wherever it came from. Instead, his jaw tightened. "Callum Jensen," he said. I already knew the name. Everyone knew the name. The Jensen family was one of the oldest alpha lines in the region. Callum Jensen had been slated for bonding for the last 2 years, publicly matched to an Omega named Dorian Voss, a beautiful, sharp-tongued man from a family almost as prominent as the Jeans themselves. Their bonding had been discussed in social columns and whispered about at markets. It was supposed to be the union of the season. "The Voss family withdrew," Marcus said, still reading. 3 days ago, apparently Dorian Voss presented a medical incompatibility report. He looked up. His eyes were heavy. "The council protocol requires a replacement to be designated within 72 hours to honor the Alpha's bonding timeline. And they chose me," I said. "You're registered with the Omega Designation Registry as unmatched and available." His voice was flat now. Lawyer flat. "Jim, you filled out that registry for the housing subsidy, not because you actually wanted." "I know why I filled it out, Marcus." Silence fell between us like something physical. Outside, the city carried on. A vendor shouted about fresh bread. A cartwheel rattled over cobblestones. Somewhere, a child laughed. That specific, helpless, belly-deep laugh that children produce when the world is still mostly a delight. Inside, I stood at the threshold of a life I had not chosen. "I don't have to go," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I heard the hollowness in them. Declining a council-designated bonding carried penalties. Financial penalties our family couldn't absorb. Social consequences that would follow Marcus in his career, follow our younger sister in her schooling, follow everyone with our surname like a persistent shadow. Marcus set the letter down on the hall table very gently. Then he turned and looked at me with a particular expression he reserved for situations where honesty was going to hurt, and there was no way around it. "Tell me what you want to do," he said. "Not what we can afford. Not what the council wants. What do you want?" I thought about Callum Jensen. I'd seen him once at a public gathering in the Civic Square 2 years ago. He'd been standing near the platform during a community address, not on it. He wasn't the sort of alpha who sought podiums. He was tall in the way that some people are tall without seeming to loom, with dark hair that the wind had entirely failed to keep in order, and eyes that I remembered as being very still, very watching. He'd had the kind of face that looked like it was waiting for something, though I couldn't have said what. I had thought, briefly, that he seemed tired. I thought about the bonding ceremony, the ritual itself, The binding of 2 cents, the formal declaration, the ancient words that would link my life irrevocably to another person's. I thought about Dorian Voss, who had found a way out. Smart, I had thought when I first heard the news. Good for him. And now I was the replacement. I think, I said slowly, that I want to know why he looked relieved. Marcus blinked. What? Callum Jensen. I picked the letter back up. I saw him once. And I remember thinking he seemed tired. But when the Voss bonding fell apart, I paused. The social column said he was disappointing to see the match dissolve, but someone who knew him was quoted separately saying he seemed lighter, relieved. Jim, you can't build a decision on a gossip column quote. I'm not building a decision on it. I folded the letter along its original crease. I'm building a question, and I'd rather face a question than run from one. Marcus looked at me for a long moment. Then he exhaled. Not quite a sigh, not quite a surrender, and sat down heavily on the bottom stair. 14 days, he said. 14 days, I agreed. The council's liaison arrived the next morning before I'd finished my tea. She was a brisk woman named Administrator Cho, who smelled of ink and efficiency and clearly viewed the entire situation as a scheduling problem to be resolved. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, spread several forms between us, and explained in rapid, clipped sentences what the next 2 weeks would look like. There would be a pre-ceremony meeting with the Jensen household. There would be scent compatibility testing. A formality, she assured me, though the word formality sat strangely when applied to something so intimate. There would be a fitting for ceremony attire, a briefing on Jensen family customs, and a final confirmation meeting 48 hours before the ceremony itself. And the alpha? I asked. Does he know about the replacement? Administrator Cho paused for barely a fraction of a second. In that fraction, I learned something. Alpha Jensen has been informed of the council's decision, she said. That's not what I asked. She looked at me. I looked back. I was not, by nature, a confrontational person, but I had spent enough years working in archives to understand that the information people withheld was often more important than what they offered. The Alpha has accepted the designation, she said finally. He has not contested it, not contested, not welcomed, not expressed enthusiasm. Accepted. Well, we were starting from honesty then, even if neither of us had chosen it. I signed the forms. The Jensen estate sat at the edge of the city's older quarter, where the buildings were built from stone rather than brick and the streets were wide enough for 2 carriages. I arrived at the pre-ceremony meeting on foot because I had always preferred walking to being conveyed, and because I wanted the 20 minutes it took to settle the particular churning in my stomach that I refused to call nerves. The gates were open. A groundskeeper directed me to a side entrance rather than the main doors. Not a slight, I realized immediately, but a kindness. The main entrance faced a street where several people were lingering with the particular studied casualness of those waiting for something worth watching. A replacement Omega, arriving at the Jensen estate, was apparently that something. I followed the groundskeeper through a garden that was extraordinarily well tended, and past a small structure that turned out to be a glass house full of winter-blooming plants. I was so focused on a cluster of extraordinary night-blooming cereus along one wall that I almost walked directly into the man coming around the corner from the opposite direction. We both stopped. Callum Jensen was taller than I remembered. Or perhaps, it was the lack of a crowd around him that made the difference. The way a person's actual dimensions become clear when they're not subsumed into a mass of other people. He was wearing simple clothes, working clothes almost, with his sleeves rolled to the elbows and a smear of something that might have been soil on his forearm. He had clearly been in the garden. His dark hair was still losing its argument with any attempt at order. His eyes. And I had remembered them, I realized. I had remembered them correctly. Were very still. We looked at each other. The groundskeeper had tactfully evaporated. You're Jim Ball, Callum Jensen said. His voice was lower than I expected and measured in the way of someone who had learned to choose words carefully. You're Callum Jensen, I replied, which was not my most incisive conversational opener, but seemed fair under the circumstances. Yes, something moved across his face. Not a smile exactly, more like the beginning of one that had stopped to check whether it was welcome. I was in the garden. I lost track of time. I came through the garden. It's remarkable. The cereus in the glass house. You know night-blooming cereus? Now the something on his face shifted into actual surprise. Unguarded surprise, the kind that happens before composure can reassemble itself. I work at the Botanical Archive, have for 4 years. The Jensen family donated several specimens to the collection in my grandfather's era. There's a correspondence file about it. I paused. I may have read it when I was researching something else entirely. He stared at me. Then he said, very quietly, I did not know that. Most people don't look at archival correspondence files for entertainment. No, he agreed. I imagine not. We were still standing in the garden path, several feet apart, with the entire weight of the situation between us, and somehow also this strange small thread of botanical history connecting us across the gap. Shall we go inside? He said. That seems like the right next step, I said. The meeting that followed was nothing like what I had prepared myself for. I had steeled myself for formality. A receiving room, perhaps his parents or family advisors present. Formal assessments, the performance of propriety that powerful families tended to layer over every significant occasion like protective varnish. Instead, Callum led me to a smaller room toward the back of the house. A study, crowded with books and maps, and what looked like an ongoing project involving detailed illustrations of regional waterways. He gestured at a chair and took the one across from it, and then the two of us looked at each other in the way of people who have arrived at a situation neither of them designed. I want to say something, he said, and I want you to tell me if it's the wrong thing to say. I leaned back slightly. All right. I didn't choose this. He held eye contact without flinching. Not the designation, not the replacement protocol, not. He exhaled. I want to be clear that I understand you didn't choose it either, and I think that matters. I think pretending otherwise would be a poor beginning. Something in my chest loosened, quite without my permission. I didn't choose it, I agreed. But I'm here. So I think the question we need to answer isn't whether we chose it, it's what we want to do with it now that it exists. He looked at me for a long moment. Those still eyes. Watching. What do you want? He asked. It was the same question Marcus had asked, but from Callum Jensen it landed differently. Less like care, more like genuine, intent curiosity. Like a person who was used to people not saying what they actually meant and had decided to cut through the middle of it. I want to understand what happened with Dorian Voss, I said. Callum went very still. Then, that's direct. I'm an archivist. I deal in primary sources. The secondary accounts I've encountered suggest that you weren't. I searched for the word grieved when the Voss match dissolved. No, he said quietly, I wasn't. Why not? He was quiet for long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then he unfolded himself from the chair and went to the window, looking out at the garden I had walked through. Dorian and I were matched by our families, he said. Which isn't unusual. And we weren't incompatible exactly. We could have built a tolerable life. He paused. But he was in love with someone else. Had been for years. A beta. A musician. Someone his family would never have accepted. And I. Another pause. Longer. I had spent 2 years knowing it and saying nothing, because saying something would have forced a confrontation that everyone was trying to avoid. Why did you say nothing? He turned from the window. Because I was also trying to avoid it. I held that. Turned it over. You didn't want the bonding either. I didn't want a bonding built on the wrong foundation, he said. Which is different. I'm not opposed to bonding. I'm not opposed to the idea of a life shared with someone. I just... He stopped, ran one hand through his already disordered hair. I wanted it to be real, and everything about the arrangement with Dorian was constructed, careful, performed. And now you've been given a replacement, I said. By administrative protocol, within 72 hours. Yes, which is also constructed. Yes, he looked directly at me, which is why I'm telling you all of this in the first meeting. Because if we're going to construct something, I'd rather we both know we're constructing it and decide together what we actually want to build. The room was quiet. Outside, a wind moved through the garden. I could hear it against the window glass. That, I said, is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in the context of this process. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite relief, but adjacent to it. I can offer you honesty, he said. I can't offer you certainty. I'm not sure certainty is something either of us has access to right now. Honesty is better than certainty anyway. I looked at him across the room. Certainty is just honesty that stopped updating. A pause. Then Callum Jensen smiled. Actually smiled, not the almost smile or the beginning of one, but a real, full smile that rearranged his face entirely and made him look about 5 years younger and 100 years more human. "You're very different from what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know," he admitted. "The designation came through so quickly. I received a file, a photograph, basic biographical information." He tilted his head slightly. The file did not mention botanical archives. The file probably said, Jim Ball, 26, Omega, unmatched, works part-time in the city library. It said something like that, yes. "The serious specimens aren't in the official job description," I said. "They're in the gap between the official description and the actual life." He looked at me in that particular way again. The watching way, the very still way. Like I was something he was trying to understand the full dimensions of. "Tell me about the gap," he said. And I did. We met every day of those 14 days. Not because the council required it. They required 2 more formal meetings and the scent compatibility assessment. But Callum had walked me back through the garden on my way out and paused at the glass house and opened the door. And we had stood among the night-blooming cereus for 20 minutes discussing their growing conditions and the peculiarities of their root structures, and by the time I realized the sun had moved considerably in the sky, we were both surprised that it had been that long. "Come back tomorrow," he said. Not a command, not quite an invitation, something between them, a question shaped like a statement. "I have the archive in the morning," I said. "I could come in the afternoon." "The afternoon is good," he said. The second day, I brought him a page from the Jensen Botanical Correspondence file, a photocopy, carefully made, which the archive permitted for private use. He read it, standing at his kitchen table while I made tea, because I had found the kitchen by accident and the kettle was already warm. And somehow, within 15 minutes of arrival, I was making tea in a kitchen that was not mine, in a house that was not mine, for a person I had met the day before. He looked up from the correspondence. "My great-grandmother wrote this. The handwriting is identified in the archive catalog as Elisa Jensen." I set the mug in front of him. She was apparently extremely specific about the conditions under which the serious specimens could be transported. 3 full pages of specifications. "She sounds like she was difficult," he said, but his voice was warm with it. "She sounds like she knew exactly what she wanted and refused to apologize for saying so." He looked at me with that expression again, the assessing, attending expression. "You admire that, don't you?" "Yes," he said. "I do." He turned back to the letter. "I just don't have the gift of it myself." "What do you have the gift of?" He thought about it seriously, the way he seemed to think about most things, as though questions deserved to be actually considered rather than answered reflexively. "Patience," he said finally. "And I'm told I'm a good listener." "That's rarer than knowing what you want," I said. "Is it? Most people listen waiting for their turn to speak. You listen like you're trying to actually understand something." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Does that unsettle you?" I considered it honestly. "A little. I'm not used to feeling understood." I paused. "It's a slightly exposed feeling." "I can listen less," he offered. "Please don't," I said, before I'd decided to say it. The almost smile. The real smile, right at its edges. "All right." The third day, rain kept us inside the study. He had a project spread across the large table, a detailed survey of water management systems in the older parts of the city, maps overlaid with notes in his compact handwriting. He was part of the city's infrastructure commission, I learned. Had been for 3 years. He worked quietly and without recognition on problems that affected thousands of people who would never know his name. I sat in the corner chair with a book, and then, after 20 minutes, abandoned the book and watched him work. "You're staring," he said, without looking up. "I'm observing," I corrected. "There's an archival distinction." "Is there?" Staring implies passivity. Observation implies intent and attention. He did look up then. "And what are you attending to?" "The way you work," I said. "You make a note, and then you look at the map for a long time before you make another note. Most people who make notes don't pause that long. The map tells me something different each time I look at it." He set down his pen. "It depends on what question I'm bringing to it." "What question were you bringing just now?" "Whether the Eastern Channel redirect would put pressure on 3 specific junctions or 4. He stood, stretched, a long, unconscious movement that briefly rearranged the lines of his back and came around the table to show me on the map. He leaned over the table beside me, pointing, explaining, and I followed the lines with my eyes and asked questions that I actually wanted the answers to. And at some point the rain outside became the only sound in the room except our voices. He smelled of cedar and something green, the garden, always the garden, and very faintly of something warmer underneath. Something that was purely him. I was aware of it in the particular way that omegas become aware of alpha sense during proximity. Not overwhelming, not intrusive, but present. A fact. I filed it away and said nothing. The fourth day he asked about my family. I told him about Marcus, the lawyering, the protective instincts, the way he had looked at that letter in our hallway and built battlements in his mind. I told him about my sister Priya, who was 17 and had recently decided she wanted to study engineering, which our parents were still adjusting to. I told him about my mother, who read obsessively and had raised 3 children in the cracks of borrowed library time, and my father, who had died when I was 12 of a sudden illness that had rewritten the entire landscape of our family. "I'm sorry," Callum said. "Not perform sympathy, just the real thing," simply stated. "It was a long time ago," I said. "But yes, it still has a shape. Grief does that," he said. "It takes up a different kind of space than it occupied at the beginning. Less acute, but still present." "Your parents?" I asked. "My father died 2 years ago. My mother lives in the house still. She is," he considered the word carefully, "she is a force of nature. She will want to meet you." "Is that a warning?" "A gentle one." There was the almost smile. "She is also the most perceptive person I know. She will form an opinion of you within approximately 4 minutes of meeting you, and the opinion will be accurate." "That sounds terrifying." "It is," he agreed cheerfully, "but it also means that if she likes you, you can trust it absolutely. And if she doesn't?" He looked at me steadily. "She will like you," he said. Not as reassurance, as a statement of what he believed to be true. Something warm moved through me at that, and I looked out the window because I didn't want him to see my face while I was deciding how to feel about it. The scent compatibility assessment happened on the 5th day. It was administered by a council physician in one of the formal reception rooms, a process I had read about but never experienced. The physician explained it matter-of-factly: a series of proximity tests, a sample collection, a formal report, nothing invasive. The kind of assessment that, in previous eras, had been conducted with much more ceremony and significantly more anxiety. Callum and I sat on either side of a low table while the physician moved through her protocol. She was professional and precise, and clearly committed to making the process feel unremarkable, which I appreciated. Halfway through, she paused, made a note, and said, "The preliminary indicators are," she seemed to be selecting her word carefully, "notable." I looked at Callum. He looked at me. "Notable how?" he asked. "High compatibility index," she said, still writing. "Above average resonance markers. In older terminology, you might have heard the phrase, well matched. The modern equivalent is approximately that." Silence. "Right," I said. "Yes," Callum said. The physician finished her notes, packed her case, excused herself to complete the formal report, and left us sitting in the reception room on either side of the low table. The silence was different from our other silences. Our other silences had been comfortable things, companionable pauses in the middle of conversations that didn't require noise to stay connected. This one had a weight to it, a particular density. "Well," I said. "Yes," he said. I'm trying to decide if that's reassuring or alarming. I was going to say complicated. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and looked at me in that attending way. "Does it change how you feel about the ceremony?" I thought about it honestly. "It changes how I feel about you," I said carefully. "Or rather, it clarifies something I was already feeling and trying not to be premature about." Something moved in his expression, quick, and then carefully stilled. "Premature," he echoed. "We've known each other 5 days," I said. "And in the context of those 5 days, you are—" I stopped. Started again. "You are someone I am finding it very easy to be around." And I didn't want to assign too much weight to that because the situation is constructed and we're both operating under a particular kind of pressure and, Jim. I stopped. "I have spent 2 years being very carefully managed," he said. His voice was quiet. By my family's expectations. By the council's timeline. By the Voss arrangement. Everything constructed, everything deliberate, everything examined from every angle before any of it was allowed to be real. He held my eyes. This, a small gesture, indicating the space between us, is the first thing in 2 years that I haven't examined before it happened. That has not been managed or deliberate or careful. It has simply been, he paused. It has been what it is. And I find I don't want to manage it. My heart did something complicated in my chest. I don't want to manage it either, I said. But I also don't know what it is yet. No, he agreed. Neither do I. Which means we're in the same position we were at the beginning. We are, he leaned back. Except now we know the scent compatibility is notable. A beat. Then I laughed, actually laughed, the sudden help was kind, and after a moment Callum Jensen laughed too, and the weighted silence broke apart and became something much lighter. And we sat in the formal reception room of his family's estate and laughed at the absurdity of it. And when we both settled, I realized I was smiling at him, and he was smiling back, and neither of us looked away. I'm coming back tomorrow, I said. The afternoon is good, he said. I'll be in the garden. The 6th through 10th days exist in my memory as a kind of accumulation, not a dramatic progression, not the sharp turn of some pivotal moment, but a slow and irreversible gathering, the way water fills a vessel, quietly, consistently, until suddenly you realize it's full. He showed me the furthest parts of the garden, the sections that visitors didn't see, a deliberate wildness in one corner, deliberately maintained, where things grew according to their own logic rather than anyone's plan. We sat on a wooden bench that had weathered to silver and drank tea from a thermos, and talked about the things people talk about when they've stopped performing their own introduction and begun to actually occupy the same space. He told me about the infrastructure commission work and the particular frustration of trying to solve old problems with new tools while managing the resistance of people who had built their identities around the old tools. He told me about a mentor he'd had as a young man, an engineer named Sol, who had taught him that the most important question in any system analysis was not how does this work, but what is it trying to do. He told me about a period 2 years ago, around the time the Voss arrangement was becoming official, when he had started waking at 3 in the morning with a low, persistent anxiety that he couldn't locate or name and had dealt with it by walking the city at night. Just walking? I asked. Just walking, he said. Miles sometimes. The city is different at 3 in the morning. Quieter. More honest. Did it help? It helped me understand what I was anxious about, he said. Which is not the same as resolving the anxiety, but it's the beginning of resolving it. What were you anxious about? A pause. The garden was in its late afternoon light, that particular goal that makes everything look slightly mythological. That I was going to spend my entire life being responsible, he said. And correct. And considered. And never once reckless. I looked at him. You wanted to be reckless? I wanted to want something, he said. Fiercely. The way I read about people wanting things. The way. He stopped. Looked at his hands, the way I've started wanting things recently. The air between us was very still. What things? I asked, and my voice came out quieter than I intended. He looked at me. Those still eyes, very attending, very present. Tea in the afternoon, he said. An obscure botanical archive fact delivered in passing. Arguments about the difference between staring and observing. A pause. Someone in the corner chair reading while I work. My heart was doing that complicated thing again. I had stopped trying to manage it. Callum, I said. Jim, he said, and then neither of us said anything for a while because some things exist more fully in silence than in sound, and we were both, I think, learning to trust that. His mother met me on the 8th day. Adira Jensen was small and silver-haired and moved with the particular authority of someone who has never once doubted their right to be in any room they enter. She found us in the garden, which I suspected was not accidental. She had dark eyes like Callum's, and they moved over me with the same still, attending quality, a family trait apparently, or perhaps something they had given each other. So you're the archivist, she said, as though she had already decided this was an interesting fact. Jim Ball, I said. Yes, my son says you know about Elise's serious correspondence. I do. He never reads the archival correspondence. She looked at him briefly. I've tried to interest him in the family records for years. I'm interested in the family records, Callum said, with the slightly beleaguered tone of someone having a very old conversation. I'm not interested in the methodology of the cataloging system. The methodology is the interesting part, I said, which was probably exactly the wrong thing to say to a man I was trying to appear agreeable to. But Adira Jensen's eyes went bright with something that might have been suppressed amusement. Sit down, she said, and gestured at the bench, and settled herself in the garden chair across from it. Tell me about the archive. We talked for an hour. She asked sharp, specific questions that demonstrated she had already done considerable research, not just into me personally, but into the archive's holdings, the history of the Jensen family's donations, the specific botanical specimens. She was testing me, but in the way of someone who was genuinely curious about the answers, not performing skepticism. At one point she asked, very directly, "What do you think of my son?" I considered answering diplomatically. Then I considered the advice of her great-grandmother's correspondence, specific, uncompromising, clear, and chose honesty instead. I think he is one of the most genuinely decent people I have met, I said. And I think that being genuinely decent in his position, under the pressures he's operated under, has cost him something, and I think he has carried that cost quietly for a long time. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at Callum, who was looking at me with an expression I didn't quite have vocabulary for. Yes, she said. That's right. She stayed another 20 minutes, then stood and excused herself with an efficiency that suggested she had learned what she needed. At the garden gate, she turned back and looked at me one more time. 4 minutes, she said, and something in her expression was warm and certain. I told you, she added to Callum, and left. He exhaled. Well, I said. She likes you, he said. Considerably. He shook his head slightly. She has not liked someone considerably and approximately a long time. She liked the archival methodology discussion. She liked you. The methodology was secondary. He looked at me with those eyes. You told her I've been carrying something. Was that wrong to say? No, he said quietly. No, it wasn't wrong. He turned back to the garden. It was the first time anyone has said it plainly. I'm sorry, I said, if it was too much. It was exactly enough, he said, and his voice was steady and careful and warm. On the 11th day, I told him about the letter arriving, not the facts of it, those he knew, but the feeling of it. Standing in the hallway with someone else's fate in my hands and feeling that bone-deep omega awareness of a life being rerouted. The lack of shaking, the strange, stubborn question that had formed in place of fear. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Why a question? He said. Instead of fear or anger, you formed a question. I'm an archivist, I said. It's how I process things. Everything is a primary source. You look at what's in front of you and you ask, what is this actually telling me, as opposed to what I assumed it would tell me? And what did the letter tell you? That someone else's life had shifted, I said. And that mine was about to as well, and that the most honest thing I could do was find out what I was actually walking into, rather than the version of it I'd constructed in my head. He nodded slowly. And what you've walked into is not what I constructed, I said. Not what anyone would have constructed, I think. You're not, I stopped. Gathered the words carefully. You're not what the situation implied you would be. The situation implied an alpha with a bonding timeline and a replacement omega and everything very arranged and managed. And instead I got someone who wakes up at 3 in the morning and walks the city because he needs to understand what he's actually feeling. Someone who spends his days on problems that don't have his name attached to the solution. Someone who... I stopped again. The afternoon light was coming through the study window. He was watching me. Someone who listens like understanding something actually matters to him. The quiet that came after was different from all our other quiets. Jim, he said, and his voice was careful and low and real. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, even if the honest answer is that you don't know. All right, separate from the ceremony, separate from the designation and the protocol and the 14 days, he held my eyes with his. If we had met any other way, If we had simply come across each other somewhere, the archive, the garden, anywhere, would you have wanted to know me? The question was so direct and so earnest and so entirely him that it required the same directness and earnestness in return. Yes, I said, without question. In any version of events where we were in the same room, I would have wanted to know you. He breathed out slowly. Not with relief exactly, with something that had been held for a while and was now allowed to settle. I would have wanted to know you too, he said. I knew it by the second day, possibly the first. The serious, he agreed. We looked at each other in the quiet of the study with all 14 days around us and 2 days still ahead, and the ceremony on the far side of those 2 days, and the whole rest of everything on the far side of the ceremony. It was a lot of space, a lot of unknown, the kind of expanse that ought to produce vertigo. Instead, looking at him, I felt something very much like solid ground. I'm not afraid of the ceremony, I said. I want you to know that. I was apprehensive at the beginning, but I'm not now. What changed? You, I said simply. What about you? He considered it for a moment. Then, I was afraid, before you came. Not of you specifically. I didn't know you specifically. I was afraid of repeating the Voss experience. Of another 2 years of something performed and careful and fundamentally untrue. He paused. The fear went away very quickly. When you said the difference between staring and observing was intent and attention, he said. I stared at him. That's a very specific moment, I said. I'm a specific person, he said. And the real smile was there, full and genuine and rearranging everything in his face. Ask my mother. On the 12th day, his cousin came to visit unannounced, which apparently was a recurring habit. Eric Jensen was louder than Callum in every possible way. Voice, gestures, opinions, presence, and regarded me with open curiosity and approximately zero social filter. So, you're the replacement, he said, immediately upon meeting me, before Callum could say anything. Eric? Callum said with a particular flatness. What? He knows he's the replacement, don't you? I'm aware of the circumstances of my arrival, yes, I said. Eric grinned. He had the Jensen dark hair and not at all the Jensen stillness. Good, I like people who aren't precious about facts. He looked me over. You're not what I expected. That seems to be the consensus, I said. What did you expect? Callum asked, clearly resigned to this conversation. Honestly, someone a bit overwhelmed. Someone performing gratitude. The situation has a certain, Eric made a gesture, power differential. Replacements sometimes come in very eager to please, very careful. He studied me. You're not careful. I'm careful about things that warrant care, I said. This seemed to warrant directness instead. Eric pointed at me. He's good, he told Callum. I like him. Noted, Callum said. Does he know about the night walks? Eric asked. Callum's expression shifted to something that was both fond and long-suffering. Yes. The waterway maps? Also yes. The glass house. That was the first day. Eric looked at me with something like genuine appreciation. In the full history of people my cousin has tried to not perform things at, he said, you are the first one I have observed who appears to understand the entire context. Good luck to you. You'll need it for approximately 0% of the reasons you'd normally need luck. He stayed for dinner. He talked expansively about everything. He and Callum argued comfortably about a dozen things. The way people argue when the relationship doesn't depend on agreement. I sat and ate and watched and felt with something that was moving towards certainty that I was watching the edges of a life. This life, the life that existed in this house. With these people. And that the edges were already familiar to me. That they had, in some quiet way that I couldn't have explained to anyone, started to feel like mine. The 13th day, the day before the ceremony, we spent almost entirely in the glass house. It wasn't planned. I arrived in the afternoon and found him already there, tending to the serious, and he looked up when I came through the door and said nothing for a moment, just smiled, and the whole afternoon rearranged itself around staying. We worked side by side in the careful, quiet language of people who have learned each other's rhythms. He knew I needed silence to think through something complex, and I knew he needed time to form a thought before he said it, and neither of us rushed the other. We talked about the specimens, We talked about the archive. We talked about nothing in particular in the way that nothing in particular is sometimes the most important substance. At some point, the light changed. The particular quality of late afternoon sliding toward evening, and I realized we had been there for 3 hours. I was deadheading a spent bloom and he was recording something in a small notebook, and the glass house was very warm and smelled of green things and wet soil and him. And I thought, I will remember this afternoon for the rest of my life. Whatever happens after the ceremony, whatever the future of this constructed thing turns out to be, this specific afternoon will remain. He looked up as though he felt me thinking it. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, I agreed. He set the notebook down, came to stand beside me, close enough that his warmth was a fact, close enough that his scent was clear and specific and warm. I want to tell you something, he said. Before the ceremony makes everything official and formal and constructed, I supplied. Constructed, he agreed, with a brief and rueful acknowledgement of the word. I want to tell you this when it is still just the two of us, in the glass house, without any architecture around it. All right, I said. My heart was very loud. I was fairly sure he could hear it, given the proximity and his alpha senses, and I no longer cared even slightly. I am glad it was you, he said. Not as the replacement. Not in the context of the designation or the protocol. He held my eyes, every word deliberate. Real. I am glad that of all the people who might have appeared at that gate 11 days ago, it was you, with the serious knowledge and the archival correspondence and the distinction between staring and observing. A pause. I am glad it was you, Jim, and I wanted to say it before tomorrow so that tomorrow I'm only confirming something that I've already told you in private, so that it can't be confused with ceremony. My throat was doing something it had no right to be doing. Callum, I said, and my voice was quieter than I'd intended, and he was right there, close, those still and attending eyes, and the glasshouse was warm and green around us. Say it back, he said softly. If it's true, and only if it's true. It's true, I said. It's been true for days. I'm glad it was you. I would choose you. A breath. I am choosing you. Past the letter and the protocol and all of it. I am choosing you. He lifted his hand and touched my face, a single quiet gesture, his thumb against my cheekbone, and we stayed like that for a moment in the last light of the afternoon, standing among the serious specimens in the glass house that his great-grandmother had argued about in 3 pages of very specific correspondence, and I leaned into his hand and he exhaled slowly, and neither of us said anything else because there was nothing else that needed saying. The bonding ceremony was held in the council's formal hall, under the high windows and the old stone arches. There were more people than I had prepared myself for. The Jensen family section was substantial. My family was smaller. Marcus in the front row with his lawyer stillness, Priya beside him wide-eyed and already committing everything to memory for later interrogation. My mother with her hands folded and her eyes bright. I walked in wearing ceremony attire that had been fitted to me with more care than I had expected. Deep gray, simple in cut, which I learned afterward was Callum's suggestion to the seamstress. Simple, he told her, let him breathe. He was already at the front standing with the administrator. He was in formal black, his dark hair making its usual doomed bid for order, and he was looking at the door when I came through it. He looked at me and he smiled. Not the almost smile, the real one. The room was full of people and significant and weighted with tradition and history and the specific solemnity of old institutions. And he looked at me across all of it and smiled like I was the answer to a question he'd been carrying for years. I walked toward him. The administrator spoke. The ancient words. The formal declarations. I listened to them with one part of my mind and held Callum's eyes with the other. When my turn came to speak, my voice was steady. All the things I'd feared about this moment, the performance of it, the constriction, the constructed quality, were not there. Because it wasn't performed, because what I felt as I stood across from him and said the words was true, had been true for days, was only being confirmed now, in public, in front of witnesses, because truth can survive witnesses. When it was his turn, his voice was low and clear and unwavering. The binding, the formal sent acknowledgement. which given the notable index was slightly more arresting than either of us had fully braced for, and I saw his eyes widen fractionally at the same moment mine did. And we both very deliberately did not laugh during the ceremony, which cost us both something in terms of composure. The administrator declared us bonded. The room moved. People who mattered to both of us stood up and made sounds that indicated they were pleased. Callum took my hand. "Hello," he said quietly under the noise. "Hello," I said. "Notably compatible," he murmured. "I was trying very hard not to think about that during the formal part," I said. "So was I. I nearly failed. I saw." I squeezed his hand. "You held on admirably." "I was holding your hand," he said. "It helped." And then the formal part was over, and the reception began, and people came to us with their congratulations and their warmth and their curiosity, and we stood together and received all of it. And every time the crowd shifted or someone required Callum's attention elsewhere, he kept his hand in mine or found his way back to my shoulder or my side. And the contact was easy. The easiest thing I had experienced in the entire constructed process, natural as breathing. Eric found me at one point when Callum was briefly cornered by an infrastructure commission colleague. "So," he said, scanning the room with the satisfied air of someone whose predictions have been validated. "How does it feel?" "Strange," I said honestly. "And not strange at all." "That's the right answer." He looked across the room to where Callum was listening attentively to his colleague's apparently very urgent point about drainage systems. "He's been—" Eric stopped. Something real moved through his expression briefly. "He's been carrying something. You said it to his mother." "You're right." He looked at me. "He's lighter today." I looked at Callum, the way he stood, the angle of his shoulders. Lighter. Yes, that was the word. I thought of the Goss of Callum quote, the one that had formed my first question. He seemed lighter. Relieved. Not relieved to be free of Dorian Voss, I understood now. Not even relieved that the misaligned arrangement had dissolved. Relieved because somewhere in his bone-deep knowledge of himself, he had understood that what was coming next, however it arrived, however constructed, would be real. And it was. We drove back to the estate in the early evening. The city slid past the windows and the light was that soft, turning over light of early night, and Callum's hand was on the seat between us with his fingers loosely around mine. "The garden will be at its best tonight," he said. "The serious. They bloom after dark." I turned to look at him. "You planned this." "I did not plan the ceremony to occur on a day when the cereus were due to bloom," he said with a dignity that was slightly undermined by the smile at its edges. "The council set the date. I merely," a pause, "looked at the glasshouse schedule when I saw the date. You looked at the blooming schedule. The cereus bloom rarely. Once the conditions align, it lasts only a few hours." He looked at me. "I didn't want you to miss it." 14 days, I thought. 14 days, and this was the person I was taking home. Who checked the flowering schedule? Who walked cities at 3 in the morning trying to understand himself? Who listened like he actually intended to understand something? "Thank you," I said. He turned my hand over in his very gently and traced something against my palm. I didn't ask what it was. I just let it be what it was. The estate was quieter with the reception behind us. The staff had put lights along the garden path. Soft, warm, small lanterns strung at intervals. Someone had thought of it. I suspected Adira, or possibly Callum himself before the day began. We went to the glass house. The cereus were blooming. I have read descriptions of it. I had studied photographs, botanical illustrations, lyrical accounts in the archive's correspondence files. None of them had prepared me for the actual fact of it. The flowers themselves, enormous and white and impossibly intricate, open in the warm air, releasing a scent that I had not encountered before and would spend the rest of my life occasionally catching the echo of in places I didn't expect. We stood among them for a long time, side by side, not speaking. At some point, Callum turned to me and I turned to him, and we were close together in the warm glasshouse air with the flowers around us. And he looked at me the way he'd looked at me across the ceremony hall, like I was the answer, and I lifted my hand and put it against his chest above his heart, and felt the steady beat of it. "I want to say something," I said, "before the night is over." "Say it, before the night is over." "Say it." "I came here as a replacement," I said. "That's the fact of it. Someone else's name was supposed to be in that hall today. Some other version of this day was constructed and then it dissolved, and the council's protocol put my name on an envelope, and 14 days ago I was nobody with my name on the wrong document. I kept my hand on his chest. His hands had found my waist, both of them, warm and steady. And I want you to know that I don't feel like a replacement anymore. I haven't for days. I feel like, I searched for the word. I feel like the actual answer to the actual question, not the version that was planned. His arms tightened around me, just slightly. You are, he said. You are exactly that. The real question being, who do I actually want? He said simply. Who is actually true? Not who the situation assigned me. His forehead came to rest against mine gently. The Sirius bloomed around us, extravagant and brief and real. You are exactly the answer to the actual question, Jim. And I breathed him in, cedar and green things and that warm, specific undertone that was entirely him. And I closed my eyes and stayed exactly where I was. There is a particular quality to a moment when you realize you are not waiting for something anymore. When the anticipation that you have been living inside, the held breath, the forward lean, the scanning for what comes next, falls away, and you find yourself entirely present in the moment itself, not its approach or its aftermath. This was that moment. The Sirius bloom only once and only briefly, and they do not repeat themselves. But I had arrived in this glass house on the first day of the rest of everything, and the man holding me had looked up from his garden work and been surprised by the name of a botanical archive. And 14 days of honest construction had led us to this specific point in time. I thought, I am not a replacement. I thought, I am the beginning. Tell me something, I said, against his shoulder. Anything, he said. What are you actually feeling right now? Not managed, not careful. What is it? He was quiet for a moment. The thinking pause. The real consideration. Like I can stop walking at 3 in the morning, he said, because I understand what I was anxious about, and the answer is here. My eyes stung slightly, which I considered entirely appropriate under the circumstances. The answer is here, I agreed. He pulled back just enough to look at me. Those still eyes, those attending eyes, not still, now actually something alive and present and very warm moving in them. And then he kissed me for the first time, gently in the glass house among the blooming Sirius. It tasted like a question that already knew its answer. 6 months later, I added an entry to the Jensen Botanical Correspondence file, not as the archive's official record. That would be improper. But as the archive staff member who happened to have personal knowledge, I added a note to the finding aid. A brief, factual notation in the style of the archive's descriptive standards, Jensen Family Botanical Correspondence, 1843 present. Collection includes original letters from Elisa Jensen regarding the transport and care of Sirius specimens donated to this institution, 1847. The collection has been expanded with the addition of materials from subsequent generations. A selection of current cultivation records from the Jensen Glass House was donated to the archive in the current year by James Ball Jensen, staff archivist, whose knowledge of the collection predates his association with the family. Callum read it over my shoulder, standing at my workstation on a Thursday afternoon when he had stopped by the archive after a commission meeting, which had become a habit that neither of us had formally discussed, but both fully intended. Ball Jensen, he said. I kept the ball, I said. For professional continuity. Of course, he agreed. He was smiling. The real smile, which I had now seen approximately 10,000 times and which still rearranged everything in his face every single time. Very sensible. The archive required a formal provenance note, I said. I tried to keep it accurate. It is extremely accurate. He read it again. Whose knowledge of the collection predates his association with the family? He looked at me. You read the Sirius correspondence before we met. Extensively, I confirmed. So, in a very real sense, I was already half in love with your great-grandmother's botanical documentation before I ever saw you, yes. He laughed. That helpless, real laugh, the one I had learned in 6 months, was one of the rarest and most wonderful sounds he produced, because he did not laugh casually or performatively, but only when something genuinely caught him. That's going in the personal record, he said. What personal record? The one I've been keeping since the second day. He looked slightly caught out. I told you I was a good listener. I didn't mention I was also a note-taker. I stared at him. You have been taking notes on us? I said. Observations, he corrected, with a gravity that was entirely undermined by the smile underneath it. There's a distinction. Intent and attention. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I laughed too. Fully completely in the quiet of the archive where I had spent 4 years among records of other people's lives. And he looked at me laughing, and his face did that open, unmanaged thing that I had loved from the very beginning before I knew I would love it forever. Callum Jensen, I said. Jim Ball Jensen, he said. You are entirely ridiculous. I learned from the best, he said. Outside, the city went on. Inside, we were 2 people standing in an archive, surrounded by primary sources, adding ourselves to the record. I had arrived as a replacement, a name on the wrong envelope, a secondary choice, an administrative solution, a body filling a slot in a protocol, and I had become, over 14 days of honesty and serious and 3 in the morning confessions and a glass house full of brief and irreplaceable blooms, entirely myself. Choosing. Neither managed nor constructed. Real. That was the primary source. That was the finding aid. That was the thing I would have written in the margins of the official record, if archives permitted such things. He looked relieved at the ceremony because relief is what you feel when the thing you didn't know you were waiting for finally arrives. I understand that now. Because I felt it too. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.